Hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and today we're going for quite a big one. We're going to speak about bioenergetics and training zones. So what I want to do with this video is basically start off with a background theory of this, and then later on in the video I want to go on to Training Peaks and show you guys how I structure training zones and the reasoning why I do it the way that I do it. Now, just as a start off, like the theory is pretty much fixed in literature, it's basic physiology, but with a practical implementation of it, it might differ a lot amongst coaches. Like we spoke of in the first video, like basically what training is about stimulating adaptation through the hormetic process. And there's a lot of ways that you can do about it. You can call your zones or your work rates whatever you want. You can structure it on a variety of ways, and all of that could work if you stick to the principle of progressive overload with intermittent rest periods. That's basically the foundation of adaptation and training, like we spoke of in the first video. But I believe that this is a very good way of doing it. It's very efficient and very easy to calculate progression and also monitor intensity and time in zones. But before I get ahead of myself with all of that, let's just start at the beginning and discuss what bioenergetics is. So basically, bioenergetics is the flow of energy within a biological system, or if you want to think of it that way, the human organism. Energy, like it's a thing that we speak about a lot in training in this kind of environment. But it's important to also understand what energy is. It's basically just referring to the capacity to do work. So we as human beings ingest a variety of food types. Let's call it proteins, carbohydrates, fats. I have to say alcohol because it is also an energy substrate, even though it's not a macronutrient because it doesn't provide any form of vitamins, minerals, nourishment to the body. It's basically just if I can call it that, an empty energy substrate. But we ingest these substrates, and throughout the body processes, this chemical energy is progressively broken down, and through the work and the action of the muscle cells, we can exert that as mechanical energy onto the pedals, and then through that we can measure like watts and work rates and all of that type of stuff. So that's basically just setting up what we're going to talk about today. So let's start at the level of metabolism and discuss what metabolism is. So there's two types of reactions in the human body. There's anabolic reactions and catabolic reactions. Anabolic reactions would be, let's take for example protein synthesis. Like the body uses energy and a variety of reactants in order to build up a protein, a muscle cell, or whatever that would be. So that's kind of like a building reaction. So a molecules are combined and a more complex structure is made. And this is energy intensive, like it uses energy in order to synthesize a new molecule. Whereas on the other hand, a catabolic reaction is where something like a macronutrient is progressively broken down into smaller pieces and energy is released. Because for any molecule to be bound to another, within the bond, it requires energy, potential energy, to be stored. So basically, what a catabolic reaction is progressively breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces and energy is released. The sum total of all the catabolic and anabolic reactions in the body is basically referred to as the metabolism. But today I want to focus on catabolic reactions, basically the chemical energy in the food that we eat, how that's digested, how that's processed in the cell, how energy in the form of ATP is produced from that, and how I'm not really going to go into muscle cell physiology much, but basically that ATP is then expended as mechanical energy through the action of muscle cells. A very important point that I want to highlight early on is that most of these catabolic reactions are hydrolytic, basically stating that the presence of water is required to break down these substrates into smaller and smaller pieces. And this we'll later touch on in videos about hydration, but I just want to emphasize this. If you look at the theory and like the long equations on how these things take place in the body, the presence of water is required. And you guys might have heard this a lot of times, whether it be in a weight loss perspective or performance perspective, that people say you need to be well hydrated. That's sometimes some of the last advice that people actually follow, but it is absolutely crucial for macronutrients to be broken down and energy produced, that you have to be well hydrated. So just one thing I want to touch on really early on. So in the body, the goal that we want to do is produce ATP. ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate, which is useless actually for me saying, but let's just refer to it as ATP. This is a high energy substrate molecule that is synthesized from macronutrients within the cell. And this is what enables muscle cells to sustain action and to contract and relax and thereby produce mechanical work. But ATP is stored in cells in very limited amounts, and that's why the body has to find ways to replenish ATP so that muscle activity can be sustained over a long period of time. Now, there's 3 macronutrients that the body can use to resynthesize ATP. That is proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Now, these are utilized in different ratios at different work rates, but there's also the okay, so let me rather start there. So there's 3 energy systems that the body uses to replenish ATP. It's the phosphagen energy system, the glycolytic energy system, and then the oxidative energy system. So let's maybe start at the phosphagen energy system. This is basically, if you think of track sprints and these very high intensity, very short activities. Let's take the 100 meters in athletics, for example. It lasts about 10 seconds. Absolutely maximal, and this is the energy that's responsible for that. So ATP is produced by the resynthesis with phosphocreatine and adenosine diphosphate, which is basically a smaller or already broken down version of ATP. So the phosphocreatine basically adds another phosphate group, and ATP is replenished. Just basic chemical reaction that happens in the cytoplasm of a cell, and that's basically energy produced at a very high rate. The only pitfall to that is a very limited in capacity. So you can only do it for, let's say, 10, 15, or 20 seconds, depending on your level of condition. But it's very, very short-lived, but the rate of energy production is massively fast. So this is why you guys will see a lot of, let's say, strength athletes, power lifters, whatever it might be, with supplements on creatine, just to help feed the muscle and feed this energy system. I think the best cycling example that I can use for this is basically if you look at the track events, like when they go really, really slow around the track, just playing cat and mouse with each other, and then suddenly it's a massive dash for the line. That is the perfect example of where the phosphagen energy system would be used. The second energy system that we're going to discuss is the glycolytic energy system, which basically refers to the breakdown of sugar at high rates in order to produce ATP. Now, there's another line that I want to draw in between energy systems, and that is that you get anaerobic energy systems and aerobic energy systems. So anaerobic energy systems basically refers to that the presence of oxygen is not required to immediately produce ATP. With oxidative or aerobic energy systems, the presence of oxygen is required. So generally, your higher work rates, so let's say if we had to set an intensity spectrum, that could be anything from 10 to 50 watts, absolutely just riding easy to a coffee shop, versus your maximal power, which would be maybe 1,400, 1,600, whatever you can sustain for about 5 seconds. Let's use that as the intensity spectrum. So if you have this intensity spectrum, it's very important to keep in mind that the higher work rates will always be your anaerobic power, and the lower work rates would be your aerobic power, where the rate that energy is required at is slow enough that the oxidative systems could meet that capacity. Now, going back to the glycolytic energy system, that is basically the breakdown of sugar or carbohydrates in order to resynthesize ATP. This is generally, if I could use, please don't quote me on this, but it's just like examples of time, would be anything from 30 seconds till let's say 8-minute maximum effort. That would be more or less where your glycolytic energy system would take command. Now, very important when speaking about energy systems, it's not like you switch one off, switch another one on. Like, all of these energy systems are active in the body throughout our life. Like, even if we're at rest, the oxidative energy system is still producing ATP at very slow rates. So it's never a thing of these energy systems are switched on or off. It's always on a spectrum, and at certain work rates, one energy system would take, let's say, the biggest role, and the others would just be in a supporting role. And as you go through the energy spectrum, different energy systems would come into play and dominate at that work rate. So let's keep to that example and then speak about the intensity spectrum. So at rest and at very low intensity exercise, the oxidative energy system, which is our third energy system, would take preference. Now, this happens in the mitochondria of the cell, which is known as the energy factory within the cell, and it's at very slow rates. And for this energy system, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats can be broken down to produce energy. Protein is not really a dominant substrate for energy production. It only happens under very certain circumstances, such as starvation or really prolonged events where fat or carbohydrate availability is starting to get low. So we can kind of push that one to the side a little and focus on carbohydrates and fats. So the major distinction on the intensity spectrum between the two is that at lower intensities, the body will focus on the breakdown of fats because fats is so much more dense in energy than carbohydrates. So if you look at a gram of fat contains 9 calories, whereas a gram of carbohydrate contains only 4 calories, give or take. That's just an average set for the macronutrient might be 3.8 or 4.2, but basically for carbohydrates, if you're using the equations, it's set at 4 calories per gram. So at lower intensities, the body will favor the breakdown of fats because it's a longer process, it's more intensive, but it has a much bigger energy yield. But as the intensity goes higher, let's say above 60% of VO2 max, as said in literature, there would be a gradual decline in the use of fat and a gradual increase in the use of carbohydrate, just because the breakdown of carbohydrate can be much faster to produce energy from, to resynthesize ATP, than fats would be. Now, obviously, people can become more fat adaptive and train those energy systems in the body to be more efficient. But once you start looking at, let's say, 70 plus all the way to 100% of your FTP, then there's a greater reliance on carbohydrates, and at the highest of energy or the highest of work rates, it will almost be exclusively carbohydrates. And that is known as a crossover principle in literature. So basically, the use of fat goes down and the reliance on carbohydrate goes up. And then obviously if you get now into your sprints and that, then the phosphagen energy system would predominate in that. The glycolytic energy system, basically, when we speak about breaking down of sugars in the body, there's generally between 300 and 400 grams of glycogen stored within the muscle if we're well fed and well conditioned for an event, and 70 to 100 grams stored in the liver. So the body can pretty rapidly break down these energy substrate and produce ATP from that. But once we get to low intensities, longer duration events, then the body would use fats and carbohydrates. And this is why it's very important to have carbohydrates on the bike, especially during higher intensity stuff, like let's say a road race, where there would be climbs or intermediate sprints or whatever it is, really hard, intense sections. It's important to keep replenishing carbohydrates so that we don't run out of, so once these energy stores become depleted, the body can then resynthesize ATP from the carbohydrates that we are ingesting during the event. It's also really important to take note that all of these energy systems are controlled by enzymes. So enzymes are basically like catalysts for chemical reactions in the human body, and each of these energy systems is controlled by key enzymes. So as we spoke of in the first video, whatever system in the body that you stress, the body is going to adapt in that regard to be able to function at a higher capacity. So let's say we keep stressing the oxidative energy system at a certain work rate. The body is going to upregulate the production of those specific enzymes for those chemical reactions in order to help sustain or resist that stress in the future. So basically, let's say if we take the training week as a whole, we have 3 or 4 days where we stress the endurance or the oxidative energy system. The body is going to upregulate the functional capacity in that regard. So you might be then better at producing energy at that work rate, and that's how you can monitor, and the body will adapt according to that. Then if you want to structure intervals, let's say VO2 max intervals, where the glycolytic energy system would be the dominating energy system to produce energy at that work rate, then you would keep stressing that, maybe structure your intervals like 4 times 5 minutes or whatever that might be, and you can say, cool, for 20 minutes of that session, we were focusing primarily on the glycolytic energy system with the help and the support of the other energy systems as well. But if you look at the contribution of energy production during those efforts, the majority of that would come from the glycolytic energy system. So that energy system is stressed, the enzymes would be upregulated, the body would produce more of those enzymes, granted that we give the body sufficient rest, and following that progressive overload over a period of time, the body would be more efficient at producing energy at that work rate. So this is why I believe understanding the intensity spectrum and different work rates is key to planning training. So you want to look at a training week and you want to decide which energy systems you want to focus on which days, and also at what different intensity levels you want to be spending time in. So I teach basically time in zone. That's the way that I program. I want an X amount of time in the week to be allocated to, let's say, endurance training, tempo, VO2 max intervals, wherever we might be in the season. That would differ, but I would calculate how much time I want to spend in each of these zones at each of these work rates to make sure that we upregulate the enzymes in all of these energy systems. This will make us better able to resist training stress and to meet the demands of whatever the race might be. So we never really know unless it's a time trial or a very specific event. But for road races, we don't really always know what type of efforts are going to be required. So that's why we want to be proficient at producing energy throughout the whole energy spectrum. And that's why we focus on all of these work rates. So what I do is I take the intensity spectrum and I break it into certain zones like most coaches around the world do. And then we decide how much time in the week we're going to spend on each at each work rate. So this makes it really easy for us to calculate progression. So let's say for 1 week we want to spend 40 minutes in the VO2 max zone. So we can then divide it up into 2 sessions, maybe 20 minutes, and from there on we can structure it and say maybe, okay, 4 times 5 efforts, or however that might look, 5 times 4. You can play around with the combinations, but then in each session you've spent 20 minutes in your VO2 max zone. Then maybe you want to increase by 5 to 10% in the next week, and you want to have 44 minutes spent in the VO2 max zones, and that's one way of structuring your efforts. You can also keep to the same efforts, but maybe reduce the rest between the efforts. So there's a lot of ways to monitor how much time you are spending in each zone. It could be tempo efforts, where you structure them out with rest periods and you find ways to progress on that. Very importantly, just keep in mind that there always needs to be the time where you deload and have an intermittent rest period so that the cells of the body can recover to the demands that you've placed on it and adapt to be able to function at a higher capacity in the future. So this is why I believe it's very crucial to break these training zones up, clearly specify them, and make sure that they're all addressed within a 7 to 10 day period. Like, we don't want to go 2 weeks without doing a VO2 max session. We want to make sure that we stress all of these energy systems on a regular basis with intermittent rest periods, so that we adapt in all of these scenarios that might come up in the race. So it's much easier if you guys know the specific demands of the event. So let's say like a track pursuit or a 16 kilometer time trial, whatever it might be. If you know the demands and you know, okay, this is what the work rate would be, this is the distance and the estimated duration, designing the performance becomes a lot easier. But if we look at like stage racing, multiple days of road racing or mountain biking, whatever it might be, we're not always sure how much time we're going to spend in each zone. But we can quantify and know, okay, this would be the duration of the event, and then we can spend time in all the intensity zones to make sure that we're proficient at producing energy at all of these work rates. And this is where experience and a bit of intuition comes in, to be able to look at a profile of a race or look at previous data and see like, okay, this is more or less how we need to design the performance. But as a general rule of thumb, especially to developing cyclists, I want to spend time in each of these zones every 7 to 10 days to make sure that the energy system or the work rate is adequately stressed at the level of adaptation or at the adaptation threshold or above, to make sure that adaptation is stimulated at a cellular level. So we would start pretty early in the progression. So let's say we've got our goal events here. We'd start working backwards, dividing up the periodization phases, which I'll still do a video on. But basically then we want to start structuring time in each of these zones to make sure that come race day, we are proficient for ample periods of time at each work rate to produce energy, so that there's not one effort where the athlete feels on the back foot, where he is not adequately conditioned in. So that's why we want to address all of these training zones every 7 to 10 days and make sure we really stress them well, so that we can gain the adaptation from that. So now what I want to do is I want to go on Training Peaks and I want to show you guys how I structure these training zones and these specific work rates. So before we go to Training Peaks, I want to just share with you guys a few key points to consider before we apply this practically. A very important thing that I see a lot of guys misunderstand is the concept of FTP. People would take their 20-minute peak power and they would say, oh, my FTP is whatever that value of their 20-minute power was. If you guys go look at the true definition of FTP, it is the highest average power that you're able to sustain for a 60-minute period of time. So we use the 20-minute test to make an estimation or approximation of what we should be, in theory, be able to sustain for 60 minutes. So when you guys devise these zones, make sure that you guys are using the right numbers and not using your 20 minutes peak power in calculating your zone. So your threshold would always be your highest average power that you're able to sustain for 60 minutes. When we spoke about the macronutrients, we also spoke about which macronutrients fuel which energy systems. And it's almost impossible to get around the thing of, if you want to do work at high work rates, let's say like anaerobic efforts and long stage races where these types of hard, almost maximal efforts are required, you cannot not consume carbohydrates. Now, I know a lot of people would disagree with me on that, but it's basic physiology. If you're not going to consume the substrate needed for that energy system would not be able to function at its full capacity. So I know a lot of people want to exclude or minimize carbohydrates from their diet to optimize their body composition. My advice to guys is rather focus on the quality of carbohydrate that you are consuming. So I would always go for unrefined, nutrient-dense carbohydrate sources such as basmati rice, quinoa, sweet potatoes, and things like that. I would stay away from the pastas and stuff. Apologies to all my Italian friends, mi dispiace. But I would really focus on more nutrient-dense carbohydrates. If you still, however, decide not to include carbohydrates in your diet, I really hope that you're in a relationship or there's someone that can wait for you at the finish line. But if the event does require high intensity intervals or efforts, chances are if you're underfueling the energy system, you are going to get dropped or you're not going to be able to finish with the front group. As I said in the beginning, very important to stay hydrated because all of these energy systems are hydrolytic reactions that take place. So the presence of water is required to produce ATP, and very essentially, as I always say, make sure that you guys have enough rest days because we can stimulate all of these adaptations within the human body, but if we do not give the body time to recover and rebuild itself, upregulate the enzymes, we would not be seeing the benefits of an increased functional capacity. So on that note, I want to go on to Training Peaks and I want to show you guys how to structure these training zones. So let's just go as a basis and we set a FTP of 360. Let's use it as threshold power and let's use Andy Coggin's one. Just to give you an idea of how these things are traditionally structured. So this would normally be your active recovery, endurance, tempo, threshold, VO2 max, and then your anaerobic and neuromuscular. So just keep these numbers more or less in mind. But what I'm first going to do is I'm going to show you guys how I would structure these zones on Training Peaks. So let's start at active recovery. Let's call it active recovery. Is my spelling even correct there? There we go. Active recovery. Okay, so generally anything under 55% of FTP is considered active recovery, whereas I would move that up to 60% as a personal preference, just focusing a bit on higher intensities for the endurance zone and leaving a bit of a broader range for active recovery. So I would start mine at 60% of FTP. Then if we look at the endurance zone, so traditionally it's said that between 56 to 75% of your FTP is in your endurance zone. So basically, if we follow this traditional model as it sets out, anything from 202 watts to about 270 watts would be considered your endurance zone. But that's a difference of 70 watts. And if you look at 70 watts over hours of training, that is a huge difference in total work done. So I would break this up into two zones. I would say, let's call it high endurance and low endurance. So let's say low endurance and high endurance. So here we can be a lot more specific with the work rate that we are doing. So let's say for about 4 to 6 hour rides, we might choose to focus a bit more on a lower work rate. So this would be about 216 watts to about 245 watts. Just another thing, guys, don't be afraid to round up these training zones to make it easier for you guys to remember. If there's a difference, so let's say this was at 243 watts, rounding it up to 245 watts is not going to be a big deal. I wouldn't jump 10 or more in zones, but if you round up to the nearest 5, it might just be a lot easier for you to remember while you're out on the bike. Then from here on, we would go from 246 and we'd still finish that then at 270. So this would help us be a lot more specific in our approach. Then when we start looking at the tempo zone, this is generally from 76 to 90% of FTP, so basically 271 watts to 324 watts. I personally choose to use 76% to 85% as my tempo. So let me just fill that in here. So that for me would be anything from 271 watts all the way up to 306 watts. So let me round up, 305 watts. Then for the threshold, it's basically the same thing. So zone 4 is classified anything from 91% to 105%. So if we're working on 360 as our FTP, this means that the threshold range would be 52 watts. Now that once again is a huge range to be working in, and I believe we can be a lot more specific in our approach here. So what I would do is I would set 4 different zones for threshold. So let's say for A, for B, for C. So let's call the sweet spot. This one true threshold or time trial threshold. And this one you could call high threshold or your climbing threshold. So let's maybe call it climbing threshold. Because these would be it. If you think again of the true definition of threshold, that's for 60 minutes. But if you had to approach a 20-minute climb, obviously you would be able to sustain a higher work rate than you would be doing over the 60-minute period of time. So just filling these in, it would be 86 to 94%. Okay, so let me just go back on this. So this would be about 360 watts to about 380 watts. From where on we'll start VO2 max after that. So let's just fill that one in. And this would be anything from above 381 watts. Okay, so now we're just going to remove these and then divide them up. There we go. Okay. So this would be 359. And if we had to say this would be, let's make that one 304. And then from 305. Okay, so that one goes about to 360. So let's say this one to 329. And then anything from 330 to 360 watts would be what we would look at if we want to work on our time trialing ability. 360 to 380. Then in the VO2 max zone, this one is pretty straightforward. Anything up to about, let's make it 329 watts. And then over here, we would have anaerobic and neuromuscular. Okay, there we go. So this would be anything basically from 430 watts up to 2000 watts. So this is what I would generally use for developing riders or people that are at under 23 level or in that kind of class. Where it would get more specific is if you're working with specific sprinters at a high level, then you can start breaking up the anaerobic and neuromuscular zone into smaller segments and work more specifically at those levels of work rates. What I teach for like juniors, under 23s, I would rather say, you know what, if you're doing sprints, go maximum. If you're working anaerobic work, I would set a zone like, okay, cool, try to hit at least 600 watts for all these 30 seconds or 1 minute or whatever it might be. I would maybe give more specific targets for the guys, but all of that would then fall under anaerobic and neuromuscular zone. So this is just a very easy way to quantify your work rates, and you can also make your workouts a lot more specific if you're looking at this. So you can tell a guy like, listen, I want you to be in zone 4C on these climbs, or I want you to do 3 times 20 minutes, and I want you to be in zone 3 in your tempo zone, or maybe it's sweet spot, whatever it could be. But this is just a much easier way of quantifying it. being more specific, breaking down the work rates into smaller gaps and really hitting them with higher accuracy to stimulate the desired adaptation. And obviously we can then structure the progression from there on.